Is normal politics about to come back as we move out of the pandemic? That's the question we're going to talk about today. Welcome to Reaction. I'm Iain Martin, editor of Reaction. I'm joined by Reaction team member Tim Montgomerie. If you're not a subscriber to Reaction on YouTube, just hit the button below saying subscribe for more of these videos every day from the Reaction team. So Tim, when we pose that question, is normal politics about to come back? I suppose we both mean really that things have been highly unusual. This state in which people have been locked down, people have looked to the government in a way for support that would have been regarded as unimaginable just a couple of years ago. And what does that then do to the contours of politics afterwards, do you think? If this is, I mean, there's a caveat, the emergency isn't entirely over, but things are hopefully normalizing.
Well, Iain, unfairly, rather than answering your question, I'm going to throw back 3 questions at you. My little quiz of the day. I have to put my glasses on because I forget the statistics. But here's my question for you. Which is the biggest post-pandemic headache for the government? Is it one, I was trying to be a quiz master here, is it one, the 5-year backlog in the NHS for routine operations, with 4.7 million people waiting for treatment as of the latest statistics, 400,000 people for over a year, the highest waiting lists, in modern times. So that's option 1, happy option 1. Option 2, is it the hangover in our education system, whereby estimates put the range of lost earnings for this generation, if nothing is done, at anything between £62 billion over a lifetime or £420 billion.
Yep.
With the poorest pupils already 18 months behind, in their education, probably now at least 2 years behind. Or option 3, and I'm afraid there could have been other options, just to cheer you up, but option 3, is it the fiscal deficit, which in the latest financial year is £355 billion, and this year, coming year, is going to be £234 billion. And so my question is, I suppose my quiz questions to you as a way of answering, are we returning to normal politics? Probably not.
Is there an option 4? What is this?
Well, there probably is option 4. You could look at Britain's place in the world and the status of the West versus the East. There could be all sorts of other options of post-pandemic, but those were the sort of 3 most obvious to me and the most worrying.
Just on that final point there, the question, and I'm not dodging the question, I will answer it in a second, but I'm least gloomy about that final proposition there about Britain's place in the world and the future of the West, because actually I think that firstly, I think what's happening in terms of the D10, I go on about this a lot, but D10, the democracies, having realized the extent of the threat from China, we're at the beginning of a process where the democracies are reorganizing themselves. So that's Five Eyes, again, that I always go on about as the key intelligence relationship in the world, plus a range of other countries such as, well, Japan is I think is the pivotal power in Asia, and Japan and Australia and Japan and the UK are starting to cooperate with a response to China in mind, which would have been inconceivable 4 or 5 years ago, or 10 years ago, when Cameron and Osborne and the entirety of the West were just sort of running towards China. So there's a rethink happening I think is really positive, and I think Britain fits into that quite well if it can get its capabilities and its defense review and all of that right. So I'm not gloomy about that. On your 3 brilliant, though gloomy propositions, I would say I would worry least about the deficit, which sounds unusual. We're both worried, aren't we, about the size of the state, and we're worried about the potential for inflation to take off. However, I think that if the recovery surprises on the upside, just in terms of growth being more robust and there being less scarring than the bank and international bodies think, then it should right itself more quickly. The deficit should shrink
I agree with that too.
The gap between spending and revenue should shrink quite aggressively, and there might be a pleasant surprise. So still worried about the deficit, but just there's a potential for a pleasant surprise. On the NHS stuff, I think you're right, but we should be worried about it. But it's very difficult to get the public interested in anything meaningful in terms of reform on this. The lesson of the crisis is the public completely loves the NHS, loves the concept, loves the reality, and the message of the crisis was take these measures to save and protect the NHS. So I'm not wishing to be gloomy about it, but I can't see what meaningfully a government can do. I know there are people in the NHS who disagree with that. It's your middle option, number two, that I'm most concerned about, which is the long-term damage done in terms of educational prospects, the way in which this generation have been, school-age generation have been treated, disregarded. They've made extraordinary sacrifices to protect older Britain and had very little in the way of thanks for it yet. And I think we owe it to them to not just have the recovery part of the plan in terms of education, but also to supercharge the economy and outperform in terms of growth, because that's the only way that that's the only solution, rather than yet more big government. I think the answer is a faster growing economy long term, which powers us out of this thing and creates opportunity. Is that a fair answer?
I think that is the correct answer, I think, in my view, Ian, and means you've got to go through to the next round, which I should introduce the challenge in the next round in a minute. But I think one of the reasons I agree with you, Jim Pickard of the FT tweeted yesterday, I think slightly in this context, because we've had Gavin Williamson, the Education Secretary, discussing his sort of catch-up package in the last day or so.
Yeah.
Jim Pickard said, we've got this whole levelling up idea for the country as a geographical concept, but he said you probably need a levelling up agenda for sort of the age profile of the country as well. And it's exactly what you've just said. The country has made enormous sacrifices in the last year or so, largely to protect older people. And, you know, I'm sure most of us are quite happy to have done that for granddad and grandma, et cetera, but it has reinforced a problem that we were already aware of before with the environmental debt that young people face, the housing market, etc. And now it's become even more pronounced through education. And so there's definitely almost like there's another whole levelling up agenda that the government is going to have to consider.
But do you think all that favours the left?
Well, that's the round two question in a way.
Oh.
You're anticipating the quizmaster here. Excuse me.
Sorry about that.
Is that I think you sort of said interestingly, but wasn't where I expected you to go on the NHS. There's no appetite for NHS reform, which I think is true. I don't think there's much appetite for reform of the teacher unions, for example. So the only way we're really going to address these issues of the backlog in the health service and the backlog in under education of some of the most vulnerable kids in our country is by spending. And we know what this Conservative government's instincts are. This is a government that chooses to spend more money rather than reform. And so I suppose the question is, who's going to win? Is it Rishi Sunak in the Treasury, who at the moment is not giving Gavin Williamson, for example, very much money at all to spend on his educational catch-up initiatives? I think the estimate was that about £14 billion of new spending was needed to catch up, which is about a third of the total education budget over a year. And at the moment, he's got about 2 billion, a year. So he's now going to be asking for an awful lot more money. But the health secretary, Matt Hancock, if he stays in position, he'll be asking for an awful lot of money. Who's going to win this when already the government's under huge pressure for infrastructure spending on its traditional levelling up
Yeah, well, I mean, Williamson's clearly furious. The word is he feels like he's been completely stitched up by the Treasury, and as you say, that's 14 or 15 billion that the government's own experts and own panel had regarded, as required over the course of the rest of the parliament. So he needs a hell of a lot more. I do wonder though whether it is an example of normal politics starting to reassert itself, in that there's such a long list of things which require spending, as you said, Tim. But Williamson then turning up with this vital request. It's old style Treasury, isn't it? To just give a sort of a 1 year extra dollop of money rather than committing to 15 billion. So it's one of the first indications I've seen of the Treasury saying, not crisis over, but in public spending terms, trying to assert some sense of order. I suppose from the Treasury's perspective, it's just all they're faced with is just a queue of people demanding more money on infrastructure, more money on education, more money on health, more money on training, more money on defense, more money on absolutely everything, while the deficit is extremely high. So the Treasury sees its role as trying to bring some sort of order and assert itself.
Yeah. And so I think we're going to be into an era now where that big question about the costs of lockdown is going to be at the heart of British politics. And if the spending pressures are difficult in any normal times, I think they're going to be some of the toughest, even with buoyant economic growth. And that's where we potentially get back into whether the deficit is actually a bigger problem, both than either of you think it is. Because if the government starts spending the dividend from growth on health and education rather than paying back some of that deficit, we're going to have a pretty stubborn deficit. And if we go into an inflationary period, that debt burden suddenly starts to become a real problem if interest rates start rising. And
so what was your second question, or have I completely screwed up the format?
No, I think it was mainly who was really going to win between the Treasury and the spending ministries. And of course, we're trying to be very high-minded in this discussion so far, but there's politics here as well, because Rishi Sunak has been seen as the heir apparent to Boris Johnson for quite some time, really. But he could potentially become one of the most unpopular people in the country very quickly. I suspect he will, plough a relatively middle path, and he'll give some money, but perhaps not enough to give teacher unions and parents and others satisfaction. But there's a real potential opening for Keir Starmer, fresh from his seemingly quite well-received Piers Morgan thing last night. There's a real opportunity for the left to do what the left always does, which is say that Conservatives aren't spending enough money. So we could be going into a very souped-up version of it, but a souped-up version of pretty traditional politics for a period.
I mean, I didn't watch the Starmer business. Was busy doing other things. I feel quite sorry for him on one level, that he feels he has to do it. I mean, someone made the point recently. Was it Charles Moore? Was it William Hague? I can't remember. Sorry, but trying to credit that Boris is the sort of, he's the anti-Dianification politician. You can't ever imagine him going on Piers Morgan and crying or expressing how he really feels, because that's not how Boris functions as a human being. He'd regard it all as stuff and nonsense, and that's part of his appeal, I think, to his fan base, that he doesn't play by the media rules of the last 25-30 years, the kind of Diana effect of emoting on demand. But Starmer's in such a hole after recent events and this surge of popularity for Boris and the Tories, that I suppose he feels like many opposition leaders before him, he just has to take every opportunity he's got to try and connect.
Yeah.
And I didn't watch it, but it does, the reviews of it do suggest that it was a that it was successful in that extent. I haven't seen what the audience figures will be, or how many people actually really properly engaged with it and are even aware of it. Yeah, I suppose the question I keep seeing on the left is, if the Tories are high spending and doing what you described, Tim, then how on earth do you outflank? How do you outflank the government? Is the answer, is Labour's proposal even more public spending, and even bigger deficit?
It usually is. And I just think that, I don't know, one thing you don't do in politics at the moment is predict too far in advance. I think it's so extraordinary. But my suspicion, though, is if you have a situation whereby Granny is waiting not just a year for her hip operation, but 2 years, and of course, a lot of these delayed treatments are potentially fatal. People who've been not diagnosed for cancer or whatever. But a lot of them will just be older people in a lot of pain, just waiting at home with some issue that needs to be treated, and waiting an extraordinary length of time. I can just see, as Labour tried to do with the NHS nurses' pay rise before the local elections, perhaps a little bit early for them to do that because our focus has still been on the pandemic. But I can easily see Labour weaponising some of these issues, particularly if the teachers, at the school gate. I think this is what Theresa May faced to some extent at the 2017 election. If the teachers and others just start saying, we're unhappy, schools aren't being properly funded, I can see an opening there for Labour.
Yeah.
It may well be that the Tories' fiscal responsibility card of, we're spending some, but we're not going to go over the top, maybe that can still trump it. But I would see, if I was a Labour strategist, I would see an opportunity in the years to come. And
you get these lightning rod moments, don't you? It just reminded me there on the Theresa May thing, where just look how that changed in the course of 10 days. That what became, when I always say in politics that very, very often what begins as being a politician's key strength ends up being their weakness. Absolutely. And their undoing. So in Margaret Thatcher's case, it's her Iron Lady status, the fact that she doesn't change her mind, that she has her principles. Eventually, after 7, 8, 9, 10 years of it, people just have had enough of that, and it morphs into a notion that, well, actually that person is intransigent and it's time to move them along. And it happened to me incredibly quickly. 1 minute Tory strategists were saying she has this magical connection with voters, different from the Boris connection, but people were talking about it in the same terms. What is it about this connection between her and this sort of mystical, Middle England, this sense that she's seen as the grown up in the room that goes into the election campaign, and within a week, 10 days, all of that has blown up. And all of that capital has been squandered, and she's seen as robotic, cannot emote, and intransigent with the nothing has changed moment. So that's what Labour will be hoping. They'll be hoping for a moment like that, where people wake up from this post-vaccination reverie and see things through a different prism. It could be, someone said on social media this morning, I don't think it will be this, but it could be the back to school education spending situation combined with restrictions in schools or something this autumn. And as someone pointed out, the government can find money when it wants for a royal yacht, which we should talk about another time, but it can't find money for schools. Now they're sums of a completely different order, but they're the kind of things that a good opposition, if it latches onto, can, if it's lucky, it just clicks with public opinion, and perceptions do change. Yeah. But I think we'll wrap things up there, Tim, unless you had a third question as Quizmaster.
No, I think I've given you enough, putting you on the spot for one day.
Well, if you're not a subscriber to Reaction, subscribe just by hitting the button on YouTube, and you get more of these videos every day with me and Tim and other members of the team discussing politics, economics, culture, ideas. And if you're not a subscriber to Reaction, to the main site, go and visit the site, and you get writing from all of the team and my weekly newsletter and lots more. Until next time, thank you for watching.